Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our live chat with Tom Linton to discuss the state of the supply chain. My name is Melissa Geringer. I oversee corporate communications for Resilinc and I'm serving as moderator for today's webinar. On the line today, we've got over 200 attendees from across the globe. We're happy to see a great mix of industries, including high tech, logistics, retail, automotive, healthcare, energy, and education. Our audience members range from company presidents to students to analysts to supply chain managers and CPOs at Fortune 500 organizations. A very, very warm welcome to you all and thank you so much for being here. Some quick housekeeping. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please use the question tab to send in your questions and we'll do our best to cover them today or follow up with you after. We'll also be recording the webinar and making it available to you after the broadcast. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Resilinc CEO, Bindiya Vakil. Bindiya founded Resilinc a decade ago with the goal to help transform the way global organizations approach supply chain visibility and risk. She was Supply and Demand Chain Executive's 2020 Woman of the Year and has become a respected thought leader when it comes to the importance of supply chain monitoring, mapping, and planning. Bindiya, I'll hand it off to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time today and welcome. Appreciate your participation with questions and your time during these very challenging and difficult times for supply chain experts, but also a time of opportunity. I am excited to welcome Tom Linton. Tom has been a very well-known and visionary figure for supply chain experts for many years, with a very impressive career at IBM, Global Foundries, and in his most recent experience as the Chief Supply Chain Officer of Flextronics. Tom has been the author of multiple very well-read and incredible books on supply chain. I think he has another one coming out in a few months. So just someone that we have interacted and learned from for many years, certainly ever since I started Resilinc. So very, very pleased to welcome Tom. Tom, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Bindiya. Glad to be here.
So as we get started, Tom, and you know, many of you know, Resilinc does a lot of the supply chain news and event monitoring, alerting customers about disruptions that occur. And I think there was a recent Wall Street Journal article that actually started with, everywhere you look, the global supply chain is a mess. Well, we couldn't agree more. I have some initial, statistics to share on that about what exactly is actually going on in global supply chain over the last few years. So as you know, Resilinc monitors in 100 languages in 50 different types of ways that supply chains can be affected or disrupted. I mean, this can be natural, climate related, as well as human-made shifts and disruptions that can build up slowly over time, profit warnings, force majeures, bankruptcies being some of them, lawsuits against suppliers, fines, environmental or labor compliance related issues. But across the board, as you can see, across the event spectrum, I would say the number of events we have been picking up on and the number of events that we have been alerting on has grown. I mean, I don't know if ever since I started Resilinc, actually, this was the number one thing that even I was caught off guard, was factory fires. Tom, talk a little bit about this, what you are seeing on the screen, and just how these types of disruptions manifest in real life for procurement experts.
Yeah, I'm sure many supply professionals have an experience with some form of a fire in their supply chain. I personally have experienced it going back even decades. I am always convinced that it's probably the one thing that we can almost expect. I would say it's something that you can almost anticipate, because you're dealing with oftentimes a lot of, in supply chain, especially in the material supply chain, you're dealing with a lot of corrugated material that's packed and unpacked. You're dealing with a lot of caustic materials. You're dealing with a lot of high energy equipment, in facilities, and you're also dealing with humans. And when you have an accidental fire, oftentimes it's people that actually have some cause to it. So it's just wherever you have all those things coming together, bad things can happen, and it doesn't take much, as we've learned this year, for it to upset an entire industry, as it's happened in a couple of cases this year. So in the semiconductor area. So I think this is no surprise. I mean, I think how many years in a row now, Bindiya, has it been #1? I mean, it continues to be the surprise, but it's not a surprise because every year I think it's just about either #1 or #2.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think only 1 year, I think you see in this chart, 2018 was the year when M&A overtook factory fires to take the #1 position. But what's really interesting is we're the same amount of monitoring, it's the same amount of industry, coverage and all of that, and just this event just is continuing to grow. And I think this year, and we'll show you some examples, particularly for semiconductor, we are literally living through some of the worst factory fires this year. I mean, the last one we heard about was Renesas, which damaged 23 pieces of equipment. Very, very catastrophic fire, particularly coming during a time of extreme semiconductor shortages too. Any others, Tom, that you think are kind of worthy of conversation here? I mean, let's talk a little bit about M&A leadership transitions. I mean, what do you see? Why should supply chain experts keep track of news about their suppliers of this type? What can these sometimes trigger, and how do practitioners
well, right now there's a lot of activity. Whenever there's a lot of cheap money in the marketplace, there tends to be a lot of M&A, right? When there's a lot of money that people can borrow at very low prices, they tend to want to leverage that to acquire things, just like in our personal life, right? We may want to say, well, maybe we should buy a house. Look at the housing industry. But so I think that's going to drive a lot of activity in the next year, as long as interest rates remain low. And what that does is it creates a change in leadership often, because it's called change of control. When you have one set of leadership merging with another, that means pretty much half the executives have to find other employment, because you don't need 2 CEOs, you don't need 2 executive vice presidents of HR, finance, etc. So you end up with this kind of combination, which creates changes in what people want to do. And I think that's probably the thing that I've noticed. And then also you've got the impact of any combination on supply chain, because whenever things come together like that, you can have breakage, and you could have some things don't fit together well, and some customers win, some customers lose as those decisions are made. And if you have an allocated market, like we have in many cases right now, those allocation processes or methods that one company has may be different than the allocation methods of a second company. So, and allocation methodologies, you would hope are first in, first out. You put your order in first, you get your order first. But that's not always the case. As you know, we're dealing with people who are making human decisions, and their relationships, and there are favorites in every industry. People who pay their bills might get favored over those who are slow to pay their bills. People who are more consistent in ordering year over year might be more in favor than somebody who's just showing up for the first time. I think a lot of industries are learning that right now as they electrify and they use semiconductors for the first time. They're showing up and they're asking for semiconductors. I was talking to one semiconductor company, and they said, yeah, we have a lot of new friends, right? They're showing up at our door at a time when we really have no more product to give, because our existing customers are using that product. So it's creating a kind of a tension in supply chain, because everybody thinks they can buy whatever they want at whatever price they can pay, and that's not always the case when it's supply constrained. It's just not a matter of raising prices, it's a matter of consistently serving customers over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's it. I want to table the semiconductor one, because we have some stuff that we can share on that, just some data on just all the things happening in that industry. I think that calls for a deeper conversation, particularly given the attendees on this call today. I know that is something a lot of people are tracking very closely. And in fact, one of the things one of the customers in the automotive industry once said is that I'm in the auto industry, but my competitors are actually Apple because I'm competing with them for capacity now. So I think that's a much bigger conversation, particularly in light of what's going on in the market. I think another one that's interesting, and we'll peel back shortly here, is cyber attacks. We're seeing a huge increase in exponential growth in that. And as you know, it's, tip of the iceberg. So just overall, as the data shows, supply chains are disrupted. I think a lot of times we have heard in the news this notion that we're going to suddenly have a supply chain that is, now going to be moving into the United States and closer to shore, or we're going to re-globalize or reshore. So talk about this chart as you see it, and how we can think about what's going on worldwide in the context of, what are the news and events that are affecting different geographies. Tom, how do we put it in context of that?
So the reality is, when you're dealing with global supply chains, there are areas of a supply chain that are less transparent than others, they're more opaque. And you don't really have good insights as to what's going on, especially when you're moving things on the ground. That's especially true in Africa, and as you get into some areas where you just don't have connected intelligence. As you get more connectivity, as you get more insights, as you have more news, so to speak, you're going to have more awareness of what's going on. I would tend to think that over time, as more insights and more things are being made in places like South America, Africa, you're going to see more of these things grow in their in their visibility, I guess is what I would say. I don't think it's fair to say that North America just naturally has a lot more going on. It has a lot more supply chain movement just because consumption is higher, demand is higher. It's still one of the largest. I mean, if you look at the top 3 trading partners, the top 2 trading partners of the U.S., it's not China, it's Canada and Mexico. So, North America then would mean all the movement of things between Mexico and the United States and between Canada and the United States. They're the largest trading partners of the U.S. So that would create a tremendous amount of that visibility on supply chain performance, I think, compared to others. It doesn't mean that it's not happening in other places. It just means, I think, that it's just much more volatile and much more visible. Of course, being democracy probably helps too, as far as what you can see.
Yeah, no, that's true. And we certainly see, that there's a lot of weather-related activity and disruption in the U.S. this year over the course of, all the wildfires in California that we saw. We saw the Texas freeze recently. We saw record hurricane season happening. So definitely those are some of the reasons as well for some of that activity. I think what is really interesting about what you said, though, Tom, about South America and Africa, not that there isn't a lot of disruption there. It's that we're not as economically dependent. But as we look at the aftermath of the Suez Canal, and we look at really re-globalizing this notion of, we may never completely reshore back home, but there will be some level of re-globalizing that happens. How do you look at South America, Africa as potential new markets as well as new supply chain destinations?
Well, one of the challenges I always had in dealing with Brazil was the movement of material from China to Brazil, right? You go through the Suez Canal for the most part. And I remember talking to the United Arab Emirates about investing in Africa, and I said, please build a railway across Africa so we can move goods as an alternative to going around Africa, over Africa, or through the Suez Canal. Obviously, there's some problems there politically, building a railway across Africa, but those kinds of things, I think, are necessary for South America to even gain more traction. I also think that North America and South America, there's no road that actually connects them. They talk about this road that goes all the way to Tierra del Fuego, but it breaks apart. It's like a dirt trail at some point. I'd love to challenge the administration to actually not go east-west, but also build connectivity north-south. I think that would be great for supply chain managers. Rather than flying things or putting things on boats, it'd be great to go by rail all the way from one tip to the other. China's doing that, right? Its Silk Road Initiative, right, really expands what they're doing from an infrastructure standpoint to Russia. And I just think, things like that need to be rethought to actually enhance this, these connections on this side of the world.
Yeah, and that what you bring up is really critical. I think, Tom, you and I have talked about this before because, China is investing in Africa, as Africa is also a known source of raw materials for China. And we're so hung up in the US about all the stuff we buy from Asia. We're not really mapping down to where is China getting its stuff. And as a result, we have not really paid attention to Africa, which is where a lot of those mines are located. I do feel we are behind China in that respect compared to in the US, it's a mindset issue that needs to change. Africa is not, just the place where we do our charity, but it's a place where I believe we strategically invest from a supply chain standpoint. It is the next frontier. It is actually, I would argue, the final frontier, where there's not only the huge opportunity to uplift an entire population, which supply chains have the power to do that. Look at how many people were lifted out of poverty in China as a result of supply chains being routed through there.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that, Tom, about Africa and the source of materials and, how do you do that? How does the government
it's real topical right now, rare earths, right? Rare earth metals and materials. And China obviously has a source of it. Obviously, North America has some, I think, in the northern part of the United States, Canada, to a certain extent, Australia. But the reality is a lot of the mining that's done is a dangerous, difficult thing to do. And it can be fraught with a lot of issues. And Africa has a tremendous reservoir of materials. Some of it is known, some of it is unknown, that I think the world will need over the next 100 years. How it actually gets moved, from Africa to other parts of the world and how it gets utilized, I think is essential. I mean, you mentioned lifting people out of poverty. I heard that, globalization alone lifted 300 million people out of poverty in China. So tremendous benefits can come from what supply chains do all the way down to the point of consumption. At some point, everything is a raw material that gets built into a product. And as we look at infrastructure spending in the United States, as we look at other big investments that are going to happen around the world, I mean, that material is going to have to come from somewhere, and it has to be built out. That infrastructure needs to be built out in order to do that. Ports, as I mentioned earlier, railroads, things like that. So we don't have to fly it all, which is expensive and obviously has its own issues.
Maybe not such a crazy idea given all the stuff and all the innovation in 3D printing is get the material out of Africa and 3D print the product at home, bypassing the entire manufacturing supply chain in the process. I'm just saying, it might be the most resilient way to mass customize our way into supply chain resilience. But just thank you, Tom. That's very interesting. I think just some additional insights into the top events. I think I'll go straight to semiconductor. I think semiconductor, Tom, you have been an expert on this particular space of the supply chain. You have worked in the tech vertical across all types of players. So can you talk a little bit about this industry? And we wrote about it in HBR as well a few weeks ago. Can you talk about this supply chain a little bit for us?
Well, the most important thing to recognize about semiconductors, it's not a quick fix because building a fab, which actually the foundry that makes the chips from the silicon, is a multi-year process. Building a foundry to actually produce wafers is not like just putting up a building. You can put up the shell fairly efficiently, but to make it as clean and as structured as it needs to be in order to produce today's advanced semiconductors requires years of advanced engineering. And then you've got to hire the skills and train those skills in places that may or may not have them. So I would think that even if you try to build a semiconductor fab today, to say that you could open the door even in 2 years or 3 years is a challenge. So the semiconductor shortage that we're experiencing right now is going to continue because the demand is going to outstrip supply. Now, I know even the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago said, well, eventually, yeah, this will work itself out. That's true in some industries, but we've got a confluence of things happening right now. We've got all these investments by governments, including the United States, going into many things, and all of them are using semiconductors. And as they use semiconductors, that's putting additional demand, which is on top of the current demand that's already in the market for all the devices that we all use. So those devices and new devices are all going to use semiconductors. And the reality is like, well, a lot of companies are discovering who are new to this, is that, it takes 4 months to produce a chip. It's, the foundry process is a fairly long one, but the assembly and test process has to occur on top of that, which is another couple of weeks. And then you've got to ship these things sometimes twice around the world in order to be made in one geography, assembled and tested in another, and that adds weeks and time to supply chains. And when you add time to supply chains, you extend them, and when you extend them, obviously you create shortages for all those who are trying to compete for that available material. So this is not an easy undertaking just because the president pulls up a chip and says we're going to invest in semiconductors and we're going to have them. That's great, but it's not like turning on a light switch. This is years to recover.
Tom, we did see a few years of tariffs and sanctions to kind of shift the supply chain this way or that way. What will it take? I mean, this is, as you said, it's billions of dollars. It's not something just one government can do. We've tried to do the protectionist way with America First, but really, isn't this multiple governments coming together and the combined might of those creating? That's why I keep calling it the re-globalized world. It's re-globalizing around a few groups of friendly countries coming together to band and create that new semiconductor supply chain, isn't it?
I like the word re-globalization. I think that really talks to the fact that if you have today, for example, 80% of the semiconductors made in Asia, and that investment continues to grow, and then you have the demand in China continuing to grow, it's quite true that Asia alone could consume all the available semiconductors in the world, even take the United States out of the picture, just because of the wave of demand that's coming. But at the same time, you have an imbalance right now of where things got made. Because of labor arbitrage, because of globalization, a lot of things moved out of higher cost countries, both Europe and the United States, into low cost geographies like China. And what that did is it shifted a lot of supply chains around. I think what's going to happen over the next decade, things are going to rebalance. It's not nearshoring as much as it is rebalancing, because as costs have climbed now in China costs almost as much as something being produced in Mexico. In fact, direct labor costs in Mexico in some places are actually lower than that of China. So now, why am I doing this? Why am I all over the place? Why am I shipping things and adding all those costs? Why am I shipping things and adding all that time when actually I can re-globalize and regionalize my supply chain capabilities in ways that maybe make a lot more sense to the balance sheet and the time it takes to get things done. But again, like the first topic, this one's going to take time because things you just can't move easily around from one geography to another. And it's more likely that things will be made in China US companies may make things in China to sell to China companies, and Chinese companies might make things in the US to sell to US companies. So, I mean, this rebalancing, I think, is gonna be necessary as costs have equalized around the world. I think that's really what's going to eventually happen as this thing starts to settle down.
And this is I mean, I could keep talking to you, Tom, about just that all the different countries around the world that can be leveraged differently in this new. See, this is the part about the supply chain world that is so exciting in this point in time is literally the people who are working in supply chain will be designing the supply chain of the future, right? This is such a powerful moment in history from that standpoint. So, you know, and as you look at the news, I mean, we're looking about so much of anti-immigration, but there's also the ability to invest in different regions and create opportunities there while solving some of our supply chain problems at the same time, where we're building walls instead creating opportunities in the local country. Can you talk about that? How fascinating it is to see that supply chain could actually be a panacea for some of our day-to-day problems or initiatives?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I've said to some folks, I said, you know, instead of building walls, we actually should be trying to be more inclusive with both Canada and Mexico because of that specific point. You know, our future, I mean, is Pan-American. It's North America, South America. I mean, that's really the supply chain dream, right? Where everything you need is within a week away. Everything you need can be obtained in very short order in very close proximity. You mentioned the book we got coming out in the fall, and really that's all about flow. The title of the book is going to be Flow, and it's about how great supply chains thrive. And they thrive based upon movement. Supply chains are material in motion. So when they move efficiently and they move effectively, they generally move in closer proximity than far away. How we got to this global supply chain, it's kind of like an opposite, and how more opposite can you be? I mean, a global supply chain from a supply chain manager's point of view is not a great thing. You know, you want to be able to get everything you need like Amazon in 24 hours. You want to get it as quickly as you can. So proximity is really important, and we talk about things like that because how things move is really key. And it is about motion. It is about the effective movement of things. So from the point of consumption through its assembly, through its sub-assembly, through its final assembly into the arms of a customer, that's the truth of how supply chains happen. And the risks that happen along the way, you can multiply that risk by doing all kinds of crazy things, moving things all over the place, building things all over the place. But if you want to mitigate risk, ultimately, it's going to be from things being more compact. It's an impossible dream. I mean, I will tell you right now, because so many things are coming in bits and pieces from so many places. But in reality, you can really de-risk things by focusing on that first and then dealing with the exceptions later.
Yeah, but I do feel, and I think you talked about it very nicely. The way I saw it is how you took it back to cash and working capital as, you know,
Yeah.
the less amount of time it takes. And I know I'm probably never going to articulate it as well as you did, because the way you talked about it is the time it at rest and how that's waste and it ties back to cash. Can you talk about that, Tom?
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, you know, procurement, particularly chief procurement officers, right, we were always driven by cost. And as we drove costs, we sought labor arbitrage, which basically is lower labor costs to drive down the cost when materials were constant. So as we did that, we added logistics costs to ship things around. We got lower costs, but as a product of that decision, we actually drove balance sheets up. Why? Because you had to buffer your inventories, you had to have more stock in movement and logistics, and plus things were farther away. And you know, you take a slow boat from China, you know, it's going to take weeks, maybe 30 days. Even if you fly inventory, my goodness, I mean, flying inventory, you can't think of something more expensive to do than that. And these combination of things cause balance sheets to grow. And I would argue even revenue was capped because when you can't fulfill things close to the point of demand, a lot of demand is perishable. It goes away if you don't fulfill it. Like if you want something today, you want to get it tomorrow. If they say, oh, you can have it in 2 months, you say, maybe I don't want it anymore. So it's this concept of of how to think about supply chains by looking at the balance sheet impacts as well as the cost impacts. Because if you look only at the cost impacts, you might do great things from your income statement, but your revenue might not grow as much as it should. And you're adding to your balance sheet, which is limiting your cash, which prevents a CFO from buying back a stock or investing in other things or giving money back to shareholders. So this concept of money somehow got caught up in cost of goods sold without a holistic understanding of how that money actually affects corporate supply chains. And I like to have this holistic understanding of how money is actually being managed and how much free cash flow is actually being generated by a company, and that comes from supply chains.
That is interesting. So I think you also said something that was very interesting to me today. You said we're not in the insurance business, we're in the assurance business. Talk about that, because assurance is revenue, right?
That's right. So, you know, there's I don't know how many $1 billion in the industry of insurance is, right? And we all watch the funny commercials on TV, so we know insurance is a big thing. But I think supply chain managers are in the assurance business with an A, not an I. And assurance is basically reliably predicting when it is you're going to receive something for a promise. So, you know, it's kind of like somebody says my delivery is going to be here. You want to make sure that happens then, because your entire system of supply chain is built upon that arriving. You know, if you're building a product that has 1,000 parts in it, 1,000 part numbers in it, and one of them is missing, you have what's called a clear to build problem. In other words, you don't have everything you need to build it, therefore everything else becomes inventory until that one piece arrives. So this idea of assurance, I think, is important, and supply chain assurance from tools like Resilinc, right, are becoming table stakes for companies, because without them, they have less assurance than they would if they were just trying to figure out themselves, you know, what the heck is happening outside my immediate range of vision, which might be limited to what companies are telling you. And companies don't always, you know, share all the dynamics of what's happening with their supply chain, because they have other customers. Some of them are your competitors, and they might be feeding your competitors some product as well as feeding you. So it's a real set of ingredients for problems. And I mean, I just, for fun, I pulled up yesterday, I was pulling up the Wall Street Journal articles on supply chain over the last few months. You'd never guess how many. I mean, there were like 20 of them, right? Just in the Wall Street Journal. And, you know, all of a sudden supply chain is front and center. A lot of people on this call, I'm sure, are supply chain managers that are getting pummeled by their management to the point where you know, it's become difficult to explain, but at the same time, you can almost hold up the newspaper and say, this is why, right? It's not me, because it's the industry. So I think supply chain assurance is a good thing. The other thing I'd encourage people to think about is, don't think about it as a supply chain, but as a supply chain system. It is actually a system of things. And you have to think not in linear ways, but you have to think broadly about all the impacts that can happen to a supply chain, not just physical, not just factory fires, and not just those things, but things like you mentioned, cyber. I mean, things like that have kind of this tangential impact to supply chains.
Yeah. So Tom, this is what you talked about. I just want to talk about this a little bit more, because, you know, a lot of times, I mean, I started Resilinc after being in procurement for more than 10 years, always chasing parts, chasing shortages, always being told it was spent. We manage cost savings, we reduce inventory. And it wasn't until I actually worked at Cisco where I was mapping the supply chain, monitoring, and really from 2005 to 10, building that supply chain data-driven and mapping-driven risk capability, risk management capability, that I actually realized that all the time that in my career, my experience was that supply chain was disrupted by the small things, right? I started my supply chain management procurement career with a tantalum capacitor, lead time being out 12 months. You remember that?
Yeah, I do. Teacher electronics.
Do you remember how much tantalum caps cost?
Yeah, they were. Yeah. I don't remember the exact price, but I know that I had a lot of problems getting them.
Yeah, it was less than 1 cent, 1 cent. And now let me talk about that. What Tom just talked about is so compelling because in my OEM career, we had products that had 60% margins from a gross margin standpoint. If we kept trying to increase or focus on cost savings, that 60% could go to 63%, 65%, etc. The problem was that if one tantalum capacitor, which was a less than 1 cent part, was not available, there would be zero margin, zero. And yet we didn't focus on assurance for years until I started working and obviously at Cisco, we created this organization in 2005 to 10, and it has been a best-in-class capability. But it was really interesting that it took companies so long to recognize that small things can cause those clear to build issues that could wipe out the entire margin. And here we are trying to optimize margin by going for 3%, 5% cost savings and thinking risk management is a nice to have.
Yeah, and multi-layered ceramic capacitors, MLCCs, went through the same thing 2 years ago over an extended period of time. And there'll be other things that will pop up. I'm anticipating there's going to be a huge surge in demand for 5G, right? Just in how that's going to be put into everything. I can't think of anybody who doesn't have at least a strategy to incorporate, 5G into their products. I mean, that's going to be the way things are connected in the future, just like 3G and 4G are today. So this shift is going to be nonstop, and I can't think of a career that's probably more interesting. I mean, you could sit there and maybe we have some students on the line, but I can't think of something. If you sat down and said, what would be the most exciting thing I could do for my career? I can't imagine anything that would be more interesting and exciting, because supply chains evolve. They're not set in stone. The supply chain today is evolving differently. You're going to have autonomous supply chains. You're going to have different ways of connecting supply chains. You're going to have different ways of doing things in the next couple of years that are different than the way it's being done today. And both from a tools and processes and strategy standpoint, and hopefully they're going to be more assured, right, than they are today. Maybe through various mechanisms the supply will be more assured. They call them supply because I often joke with the executives in companies, that supply chain managers don't lose their jobs because the costs are too high, but they will lose their jobs if they don't supply the company with what it needs. Because you may have higher costs and lower profit, but if you don't have supply, you have no revenue. So it's a different issue. And one is greater than the other. So I think supply assurance is really number one for supply chain managers, especially today. I know for a fact that a lot of people are trying to get semiconductors at higher prices and unable to get them even at higher prices. Yeah. So this is
here's just to give you a sense, Tom, of what has happened due to the semiconductor supply chain and just the automotive industry. This gives you a sense for it started in November, and I was looking at what has happened through the end of March, and you can see how many these little devices and how many companies have gone lines down. And Tom, talk a little bit about what it means when this many companies go lines down. I mean, the auto company that is going lines down then isn't buying seats, and they're not buying threads, and they're not buying. How does this ripple? Like there's almost like a bullwhip effect going through the supply chain, right?
Yeah. So I mean, what happens is when an auto assembly plant stops making trucks or whatever it may be, it's not just the employees that are impacted. It ripples all the way down the chain. And supply chain is like a living, the first book we did in 2016, we called it The Living Supply Chain. And the idea really came from ecosystems. If you think about how the environment works, right, you talk about ecosystems collapse. We saw when the Galaxy phone fires happened to Samsung, right, that entire ecosystem collapsed on them. All the suppliers that feed the parts to make those products, they had major issues. So supply chains ripple, as just like a river flows. When it's flowing well, it flows well, but you disturb it, and it gets disrupted. So this idea of an ecosystem collapse, is a problem. But at the same time, you need to think about OEMs or product companies as really the top of their food chain. So what they do and the policies they set and the way they operate have enormous implications on all the suppliers and the suppliers' suppliers and the suppliers' suppliers down the line. And this kind of problem caused by maybe one part of a supply chain can impact not just the vertical, not just the truck, not just the people making the truck, but all the suppliers that are supplying the factories, because all of them go on pause. All those factories go on pause. I was encouraging a supply chain manager in another industry they were looking for parts. I said, well, you might want to call some of the automotive guys up, because they may have some parts on their hands for a while, because until they have everything they need, they might have some extra inventory on hand. So people who have extra inventory are the ones that right now are going to struggle, because their balance sheets are going to explode, because if all that material is coming in and you can't turn it off just because you're missing one or two things, then you're going to have to get rid of that inventory. So there might be some opportunities for people to shop around to some companies that have backlogs caused by the semiconductor shortage. They may have other semiconductors that they could sell you based upon the fact that one of them they are looking for they can't get, for example.
Yeah, and this can have long-term, as you know, Tom, this can have long-term consequences, right? I mean, after the Japan earthquake, we had the Thailand floods in 2011, and disk drives were extremely disrupted. And I saw in the months after that Intel had a $2 billion impact to their revenue, and Intel doesn't buy disk drives. It's just that the companies that use disk drives, they weren't buying Intel processors, because for a period of time, all the lines were down and supply chains were constrained. So the thing here is very interesting is this can almost trigger some force majeures, or not force majeures as much as probably bankruptcies or profit warnings on part of suppliers to those tier ones or those other suppliers who have seen a complete drop in demand if this many car companies actually drop their signal. I think the other thing that was interesting is the imbalance can be, as Tom, you mentioned, this can ripple, because many companies who see the signal dropping this much might delay some capacity expansion plans that they might have, which means that this causes that further, outlook of, as soon as this demand surges, sometimes it surges back with a vengeance, and companies have paused additional expansion projects that they might have in motion, thinking this is like a permanent signal change. Any thoughts on that and how that can affect?
Well, when it comes to high tech, I think the world has really changed. Just like when the electric light bulb came and when the Industrial Revolution happened, it's almost like the invention of the wheel. I mean, connectivity in and of itself is like the wheel, right? Because you have fundamentally changed how everything communicates with each other. The fact that cities can talk to itself, or you can pull up in a car and the car's talking to the traffic light and says, hey, you don't have to be red, could you make it green for me, because there's nobody else on the other side. And things like that are going to happen, where the intelligence of things, the edge, as the word is used, right? The edge is getting more intelligent, and as the edge rises, it's not like the rise of the machines, but it's definitely going to be the intelligence of the edge that's going to capture so much attention over the next few years. The internet's just a utility. It's the edge that's going to get smarter and smarter, and it's going to start to do things. Sometimes we'll enable it to do it on its own. Maybe trucks will say, hey, I'm empty. Could you add? You might even talk to a container and say, how much is in that container? And that container will say, I've got 5 boxes. Well, I've got room for 5 boxes. And the truck and the container have a conversation. I mean, those kinds of things in the supply chain of the future are not unthinkable. And as this edge and all of its connected intelligence gets built out, supply chains are going to be quite a ride for those who enjoy supply chain management. It's going to be quite a ride.
So Tom, as we look at all the different things going on, I mean, one of the things as we look at the state of the supply chain, if you will, we have so many of these, I don't know if ripples is the right word anymore. It feels like COVID was this massively turbulent event, and we're now seeing rippling waters on top of turbulence that was like a pre-existing condition. How would you, I mean, you're right, you've talked about the living supply chain. Can you talk about this ecosystem now and what should we expect over the next 12, 18 months?
Well, I think COVID-19 actually has, it's going to be more of a global impact now and less of a, I think, less of a U.S. impact, to be honest with you. I think as the U.S. vaccinates, it will be, I saw a chart recently that showed that, like some countries will not have the vaccine till 2025. So you're looking at the next 4+ years of disruptions caused by COVID, because certain parts of the supply chain, which involve some of those countries, are going to be slowed down or impacted or limited in some way. So it's not, I mean, as we all know, domestic airports are jammed now in the U.S. People are flying from domestically, right? But there aren't many countries that allow Americans to land and come in. And so it's a global problem, and that is going to continue for a number of years. If you look even aggressive countries like, say, a Singapore, a Taiwan, a Hong Kong, they're looking at being vaccinated toward the end of this year, beginning of 2022, and they're the next most best after what the U.S. is doing. So this is, it's exciting and it's great to see what's happening, in the United States in terms of vaccination rates, but think outside the U.S. and it's a different story.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because and just to tie back vaccinations back to supply chains, it's, if you have this continuous resurgence, then you have continuously reimposed lockdowns, and again with the imposition of measures, so factories can't operate at 100% capacity. I mean, a lot of these are some of the reasons why we're seeing so many decommits from suppliers, delivery delays, allocation type of situations, is that the supply chain is still in that social distancing type of mode, and vaccination is supposed to be our way out of that, and we aren't seeing an end in sight. So,
and we have forgotten the one thing that has always caused issues for mankind, and that is things like wars and things like terrorism. That's been relatively localized, I guess, from a global standpoint over the last 20, 30 years. But there could be some other disruptions that we don't know about, not just weather related, not just COVID related, not just other related, but it could be things like that.
So as we look out the next 12 months, Tom, what should be companies' focus? I mean, how do they engage with their suppliers in this new normal? A lot of companies think, well, I'll invest in a supply chain risk management capability of my own. I'll map my suppliers and all of that. But I think a lot of times companies forget they are part of an ecosystem, and no one player can be resilient in isolation. So for the companies who understand that, how do you influence your suppliers to adopt and become more resilient as well? How do you facilitate and improve transparency in the supply chain so that we're all part of this shared outcome, which is assurance for the supplier, revenue assurance for the supplier, and continuity assurance for the customer?
Well, first and foremost, it comes down to visibility, right? You've got to have visibility in your supply chain. Without it, you're flying blind, you're driving blind. And if you don't have deep visibility in multiple levels of your supply chain and have ways to mitigate impacts when they occur, you have to do almost scenario planning. You got to look at, you got to simulate your environment. You got to say, okay, if this factory went down, what would I do? If this supplier went down, what would I do? And have in your back pocket those kinds of scenarios so that you're not surprised. I mean, supply chain leaders should not be surprised. They should, I call it crisis du jour. I used to wake up every day and I'd say, well, okay, I'm anticipating something. I don't know what it is, but there will be something. So mitigate it. Try to do everything you can to mitigate it. It comes from visibility. It comes from knowledge. It comes from knowing what's happening, seeing what the scenarios are. If you want to drive at faster speeds, right, you better get better headlights, right? You better have better sensing technology. So you have to sense your supply chain. You have to see it. You have to know it, and sensors, you know, in a way, you know, Resilinc is sensing. It's a sensing company, right? It senses the what's happening out there and provides information so people can navigate better. They can move things more fluidly. And this is going to grow. Artificial intelligence is going to enable more of it. You know, we'll have greater visibility than we've had before every generation as we come along. And I think, you know, as I expressed earlier, I think, you know, supply chain design is where it all begins, and understanding all the ramifications of what if. You don't want to have the name in front of your office door that just, when we have offices again, when it just says uh-oh, you know, that's not good, right? You don't want to be the uh-oh guy. But a lot of times supply chain managers tend to be that way, right? Where they actually are surprised. And I would say the goal would be to focus on limiting to the very small amount, the amount of surprises that you have. And at this time, you know, although travel is restricted, try to develop deeper relationships with your first tier suppliers, and then work with your first tier suppliers to get a deeper understanding of your second tier suppliers. And I think this is a good time to do that. I mean, in the next 9 months, you know, 2021 is still a period of recovery. Start to unpack those relationships, carve out the most strategic suppliers and treat them differently. Make sure your CEO is talking to the CEO of your top suppliers. Make sure even your CFO is talking to the CFO of your top suppliers. Try to get relationship structures in place that allow you to communicate when things go wrong. Because when things do go wrong, it's kind of nice to have, just like, you know, for those with school children, right? You've got the telephone tree, or you've got some way of communicating, right? You've got to have a way of communicating in the supply chain when things go wrong. And if you don't know people in your supply chain, if you're calling that supplier for the first time in your life, calling them for the first time in your life in a crisis is maybe not the best time, right? So try to work on the relationship side is what I encourage.
But I think that what you said is, I think every procurement expert, I think, might be thinking, well, yeah, we do got strategic suppliers, check. Talk to them, check. I do all of that. I think what Tom is really saying is, and what Tom didn't quite say, but he means, and I just want to make sure, Tom, I don't put words in your mouth, but when we say strategic, what we're not talking about is the high spend people. What we're talking about when we say strategic is those suppliers that could bring you down, because they may not be the highest spend, but they impact a disproportionately high portion of your revenue, right? Tom, talk a little bit about that revenue impact.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you mentioned tantalum capacitors, but a couple of years ago it was multi-layered ceramic capacitors, and this year it's just more broadly speaking what semiconductors are doing to bring lines down. So I think it's this comprehensive way of understanding what risk is and what risk is not, right? So, yeah, you know, risk is, for example, slipping on the ice in front of your house, not necessarily worried about the tornado that might hit it, right? It's risks sometimes are different and perceivably than what they actually are. There was a book written several years ago, which I kind of like, called Factfulness, and it says, you know, all the things that people fear they could die of, right? Basically, you know, none of them are really true. What they're, you know, so, you know, we're always worried about, you know, you walk in the woods and a wolf is going to attack you. Well, what are the odds of that, right? So, you know, it's when you look at the odds, supply chain managers have to think in terms of odds, right? If you have a part that's made in one factory in one country, and you don't have a replacement for that one part in one factory, even if it's a penny, you better pay attention to that specific supplier on that specific situation, even though they may not even make your strategic spend list.
I have a story about that. It was about, you know, when we first started Resilinc, this was something we did, we always do through our product, is we quantify everything in terms of revenue impact. So we did this for about 50,000 parts for one of our customers, and we went to the chief procurement officer when we were presenting it, and the CPO says, what are you telling me? This one label is $8 billion in revenue impact, and it's the person says, are you saying that this label is my most critical part? And we go, yeah, well, that's 7 billion in revenue impact, but it's a label. I can resource that. And the category manager says, no, actually we can't, because that's our anti-counterfeit label. So it's only one site that builds it. We can't hold too much inventory for it, because if the inventory gets stolen, then it jeopardizes our anti-counterfeit program. And so this one label was a $8 billion revenue impact part, which they ended up having to set up a backup site for. Because the thing was, if you don't have that, you cannot ship. You could have everything else ready to go, and you cannot ship your product without that label. So I think there are these hidden failure points in our parts and products that we may not be paying close attention to. And spend is familiar. We see this time and time again, where we're talking to suppliers, our customers, segmenting the supply chain by the highest revenue impact, and they keep coming back to, oh, but my 50 spend suppliers, these are the ones I want you to map for me first. And we're like, no, you don't need to map your 50 high spend suppliers. Map your highest revenue impact 20 that are sole or single source, and that's where you need Resilinc. So this is where you manage risk. Tom, speaking of the state of the supply chain and the outlook, and you and I've talked about cybersecurity. As I showed you, the occurrence of cyber attacks is increasing exponentially. This was a 3-year view, but if you just look at March alone, right, we see how many events happened, and in cyber attacks, not everyone is publicly known. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, as you know. There's all this stuff that is currently going on. We're living our life not knowing we may already have been compromised. How does this get, how should supply chain experts look at this emerging but very critical risk, which we both agree is one of the biggest threats to supply chain for the future?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I would, I don't want to be pessimistic here, but I think supply chains need to prepare for impact. I think this, if you hadn't had a problem, you will, because there are so many ways in a connected world that cyber is really through the connected. If you're unconnected, you live in an analog world, and congratulations, you're not going to have a problem. But if you're in a connected world, like I think most people are, you have to prepare for it. And by preparing for it, I think you have to look at all options on the table as to what that means for you and your supply chain. How do you go offline if you need to? Back to the analog telephone tree. I mean, how do you do that in a world where you actually do have all your devices connected, all your logistics connected, all your factories connected, all the machines in the factories connected? All the people connected to all the machines in all the factories, and all these pathways in for malicious actors to actually cause a problem. I think that is the normal world of today, and it's you can do everything possible to wrap your house in a security system, but you could still have problems. So I think the same is true of supply chains. You just have to prepare for a problem. And do the best you can to avoid those problems by building as much resilience in your supply chains as possible. But unfortunately, I can't say that it's fully avoidable, just because it's not a singular way in. It's too many ways in through. I think one company even went through air conditioning units or something. I don't know. I mean, there's so many ways, and if that air conditioner is connected to something, there's a way into the company. So as you read about all the different stories, I think you're going to find that, wow, okay, I may not be able to prevent it all, but at least I can do my best to harden myself against it and prepare for those issues, prepare for them when they do occur.
Yeah, so I just wanted I know that there were some questions, Melissa. Back to you if you would like to take over and.
Sure. Yeah, you guys actually did a really good job of answering some of the questions that had come in. So I feel like we hit a lot of the big ones that had come in. I did have one come in about sustainable supply chains. What do you think should be the national and global policies to assure supply and get to a sustainable supply chain? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think obviously many companies create their sustainability policy. There are many industry organizations such as the Pharma Supply Chain Initiative in the pharmaceutical industry that have grouped companies together to look at a unified policy around sustainability and CSR for their industry. There are certain industries or companies that create their sustainability policy and make sure suppliers subscribe to that and follow it. There are audit programs and assessments that they do create to make sure that the supply chains follow those requirements that the brand owners have around sustainability, CSR. I think at the end of the day, the biggest risk for sustainability from a supply chain standpoint is obviously we all as supply chain experts want to make sure that our supply chains are not harming the environment or harming people in any way. But also there is a brand risk, right? So there's negative news or publicity that might cause some massive brand issues for our employers and companies. And so this is where ensuring that we have a continuous monitoring capability for our suppliers in addition to the assessments and audits is really important. Tom, anything to add on the sustainability side to that?
Yeah, well, I think, Bayer's and Thomas Udenson there started the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. And I think as procurement managers, right, if everybody's on the same page and actually follows, the same set of principles, it's kind of like what we did for the UN, pledge. So I think, when it came to child labor and human slavery and things, I think there's more to be done. But I think if everybody kind of starts with the basic principles, I think that's the best way to go, because sustainability is a risk. It will be a risk in the future because if you promise one thing and the consumer says, well, wait a minute, you said this was sustainable, but I've got evidence to say that it's not. That would be disastrous for a brand, right? A brand could actually have impact if, for example, somebody says it's one thing and it's not. So I think sustainability is going to become more like that. It's going to become more of a, you're going to have sustainable products. And as you have sustainable products, you're going to have to be able to prove that those products are, in fact, the supply chain is sustainable.
Yeah, and many of our customers, this is what we see them doing is they're assessing they publish their sustainability policy and requirements that suppliers comply with those and subscribe to their sustainability policy, as well as do an in-depth assessment of the suppliers' capabilities and management systems around sustainability, CSR, etc. But they don't just, it's the trust but verify system. So they also monitor, and that's one of the things you probably saw in my first slide where we're monitoring for chemical spills, leaks, environmental compliance and violations and labor violations or those types of things that get alerted in public domain. Not only monitoring your own direct suppliers, but your second and third tier suppliers as well, because a lot of times, and this was the classic example for Walmart and the Tazreen Fashions example a couple of years ago, where the Bangladesh factory had a fire. It was a subcontractor, and Walmart got a lot of negative press as a result. So not knowing Tazreen Fashions is in your supply chains is a problem for Walmart if they didn't know it. So this is the reason why it all comes back down to supply chain mapping and monitoring not only your tier ones, but also the sub-tier suppliers who are involved, because a lot of times the problems with sustainability and CSR exist at the sub-tier level.
Thank you so much. Yep, I'm back. Seems like a webinar on sustainability and perhaps cybersecurity are in our future here. Those are two big hot topics. So I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. Thank you again to Bindiya and Tom and to our audience for attending today. We're going to be sending out a recording, and we'll have a recap published soon on our blog over the next week, so please be on the lookout for that. For those of you who didn't get your questions answered, I have noted them, and we will get back to you directly, or again, we'll incorporate this into a future webinar. So in the meantime, please take care, stay well, everyone. And again, thank you to Bindiya and Tom. That was a great, compelling conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Best of luck.
Bye-bye.
Bye.